The Galactic Empire scanned it twice. Impossible. That can't be a human warship. Commander Varath Sul had been filling out the same patrol report for 3 hours. Not because it was complicated. It wasn't. The Varen corridor was empty space. It had always been empty space. The report said, nothing here, nothing found, no anomalies, no contacts, no reason to have been here at all. He had written a version of this report 411 times in 6 years. He knew the exact number because his ship, the ISV Korath Asterisk, kept a mission log that he had stopped reading 2 years ago because it depressed him. The Varen corridor was a stretch of deep space between 2 Dominion sectors that nobody owned and nobody wanted. It had been assigned to Varath Sul's patrol rotation, the way boring things got assigned to reliable officers. Quietly, without explanation, with the implication that doing it well meant you would continue to do it forever. He was a commander in the Orathi Dominion fleet. He had 30 years of service. He had a commendation for the Peli system incident that nobody remembered anymore, and a scar on his left forearm from a training exercise that had gone wrong before he learned to be careful. His crew respected him. His superiors found him useful. His career had become, somewhere in the last decade, a very long corridor of its own leading somewhere he had stopped checking. He was 53 years old, and he was filling out a form about nothing. "Commander," Fleet Analyst Soren's voice came from the sensor station, flat and professional. "Routine scan complete. Tagging results for log." "Confirmed," Varath Sul said without looking up. A pause. Then, "Commander." Soren's voice was the same volume, same professional flatness, but something in the space between the words was different. Varath Sul had been in space long enough to know the difference between a man who had something routine to report and a man who was trying very hard to sound like he did. He looked up. Soren was staring at his screen, not reading it the way you read a screen you understood, reading it the way you read a sentence that doesn't make sense the first time, so you go back to the beginning and try again. "What is it?" Varath Sul asked. The scan returned an error. Varath Sul set down his stylus. "A sensor malfunction." "I don't know yet." Soren's hands moved over the controls, running it again. Varath Sul waited. Around him, the bridge carried on navigation monitoring their drift, communications cycling through the standard frequency checks, 2 junior officers on the far side of the room arguing quietly about something that had nothing to do with work. Normal. All of it normal. The sensor system on the ISV Korath was a Tier 8 resonance array. It had been the standard in Dominion fleet vessels for 200 years. It didn't make errors. It had returned incorrect readings exactly twice in its entire operational history across all Dominion vessels, once due to a catastrophic solar event near the Dran Nebula, and once because a technician had spilled a liquid into the calibration port and then tried to hide it. The resonance array itself had never been wrong, not once in recorded Dominion military history. Soren ran the scan again. He looked at the result. He ran it a 3rd time. "Soren," Varath Sul was standing now, moving toward the sensor station. "Talk to me." "I'm getting a contact." Soren's voice was very careful, the way you hold a glass you think might be cracked. "In the corridor." "Yes, sir." "What kind of contact?" Soren looked at him, not at his screen, at him, which was when Varath Sul felt it, the first real thing he had felt on this ship in a very long time, a cold pressure somewhere under his ribs that had no name yet. "The kind I can't classify," Soren said. "They put it on the main screen." The sensor return showed a vessel. At least, the computer was calling it a vessel because it had mass and it was moving, very slightly, in the kind of slow drift that powered objects do when they're holding position without burning hard. But the profile was wrong. Not wrong like a glitch. Wrong like someone had drawn a ship and then refused to follow the rules about how ships were supposed to look. The mass reading was first. Varath Sul read it. He read it again because the first reading didn't land the way numbers usually do. It slid off, went somewhere else, came back with the wrong weight. The thing in the corridor masked more than anything in the Dominion's active military registry. Not more than any single class, more than any single entry, including the *Orathi Prime *class dreadnoughts, which were the largest vessels the Dominion had ever constructed and had never actually been deployed because just building them had nearly bankrupted 2 sector governments. This thing was bigger. Power signature, Verathsul said. I can't match it, Soren said. I've run it against the full Dominion library, against the known alien technology register, he stopped, against everything we have on file. The drive type doesn't match anything I can identify. The drive type doesn't match, Verathsul repeated, not asking, just saying it out loud to see if it made more sense outside his head. It didn't. No, sir. And it's just sitting there. Yes, sir. It was. The contact was stationary holding position in the middle of the corridor with the calm of something that had decided where it wanted to be and had no interest in moving. No aggressive posture. No weapon lock, at least none that the Korath *S sensors could detect. It was simply present. The way a mountain is present. The way a fact is present. Get me a visual, Verathsul said. The optical array took 30 seconds to resolve the image at this distance. When it came through, Verathsul looked at it for a long moment. The ship, and it was definitely a ship, he could see that now was dark, not painted dark. Built dark the way ships built in cold space tend to absorb light rather than reflect it. The hull had a quality he had trouble naming at first, and then he named it, weight. It looked heavy in the way that old things look heavy, not rusted or damaged, just settled into itself, like it had been there long enough to belong to the corridor the way stones belong to riverbeds. It was enormous. He had known it was enormous from the numbers. Seeing it was different. Seeing it made his chest do something. There was a marking on the hull. He could see it now that the image had sharpened along the forward section, large enough to read from here, in what appeared to be a language he didn't immediately recognize. And below the text, a symbol, an image. A planet, blue-green with one natural satellite, surrounded by a ring of small white shapes that might have been stars. Run that symbol, he said. Soren was already running it. The database search took less than 10 seconds. It came back with a match. Verathsul read the file header. Species classification, human. Homeworld, Sol III local designation, Earth. Tier 2, pre-warp, non-aggressive, no significant military development noted. Last survey, 178 years ago. He stared at that for a while. Then he read the file itself, all 2 pages of it. It was the kind of file you wrote about something you had glanced at and decided wasn't worth more than a glance. Pre-warp, biological, moderate population, resource-poor system by Dominion standards, no FTL capability at time of last contact, no formal military structure. No record of contact with other spacefaring species, beyond a brief, incidental survey encounter 200 years ago, which had been logged as uneventful on the Dominion side. 2 pages. For an entire species. He looked back at the screen, at the enormous, dark, completely impossible ship sitting in empty space with a blue planet painted on its hull. That's a human ship, he said. Soren didn't answer. The answer was obviously yes and obviously impossible, and saying either one of those things out loud felt like it would change something in the room that couldn't be changed back. Hail them, Verathsul said. The communications officer sent the hail. Standard protocol, species identification, vessel identification, statement of Dominion authority over the corridor, request for intent declaration. Formal, by the book, the kind of hail you sent to things you understood. The channel opened. A voice came through. Human unmistakably, He had heard recordings from that old survey file, and whatever else had changed about this species, the sound of them hadn't. The voice was female, low, unhurried. The slight, strange cadence of a language built on different roots than his own, translated through a system that smoothed the edges but left the rhythm intact. It said, "Galactic Dominion Patrol Vessel. You've been in our space for 11 minutes. A pause. We've been watching you for 10. The bridge was quiet. Verath Sol said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say. Because the sentence had taken up all the space in the room, and he needed a moment to find a way to stand inside it. 11 minutes in the corridor. Watched for 10. Which meant they had been visible to whatever sensors that ship carried within 60 seconds of entry. Which meant the asterisk Korath had been under observation the entire time his crew was running routine checks and arguing about nothing, and he was writing his report about empty space. The space had not been empty. He looked at Soren. Soren was not looking at his screen anymore. He was looking at his hands. They were flat on the console, very still. The kind of still you hold when you've decided that the best thing to do right now is not move. Verath Sol turned back to the main screen. The great dark ship sat there in the corridor, patient, massive, utterly, completely, impossibly real. He thought about the report he had been writing. Nothing here, nothing found, no anomalies, no contacts. He would need a new form. He wasn't sure the Dominion had one. The Galactic Empire scanned it twice. Impossible. That can't be a human warship. Admiral Hessa Crane was drinking bad coffee when the Dominion ship hailed them. She had known the hail was coming. She had been sitting in the command chair of the UNSS Verdun for 3 weeks waiting for exactly this. The moment the Dominion patrol swept the corridor and found what was sitting in the middle of it. She had calculated the sweep schedule from publicly available Dominion navigational data, which humanity had been quietly collecting for 80 years, cross-referenced with patrol rotation cycles that their long-range observation posts had been logging for the last 40. She had been, within 2 days, exactly right. And now the moment was here and she felt nothing dramatic, not triumph, not relief. More like the feeling you get when a very long calculation finally comes back, with the answer you already knew it would have. She drank her coffee. It was terrible. It was always terrible on long deployments because the recycled water did something to the flavor profile that no amount of engineering had ever fully solved. She had been drinking it anyway for 31 years of service, and she had made a kind of peace with it the way you make peace with things that are unpleasant but constant. "They're hailing us," said Lieutenant Dav Akafer from the tactical station. "I know," said Crane. Akafer was 29 years old. He had been with her for 3 years, had applied for this assignment 4 times before she approved it, and had spent the entire 3-week wait vibrating at a frequency that she couldn't hear but could feel whenever he was in the room. He was good at his job. Excellent, in fact. His hands never shook when he worked. His voice never changed. Everything else about him was shaking right now. She understood it. She did. She just didn't share it, not because she didn't feel the weight of the moment, but because she had been carrying it for so long that it had settled into her bones and stopped feeling like a weight and started feeling like just the shape of her. "Admiral," said her communications officer, "they're on standard diplomatic protocol. Full species identification request, Dominion Territorial Authority Statement, Intent Declaration Demand." "I heard it," Crane said. She took another sip of bad coffee. "Tell me when they've finished." "They finished." She leaned forward slightly in her chair and said, clearly and without hurry, "Galactic Dominion Patrol Vessel. You've been in our space for 11 minutes. She paused. "We've been watching you for 10. She sat back. Akafer was looking at her. She could feel it. "Now we wait," she said. He said quietly, "How do you feel?" She thought about it. That was the thing about Akafer. He asked questions that deserved real answers, so she gave him them. "The same way I felt before," she said. He waited. She had expected that too. "Like we're still owed," she said. HFY nodded once slowly and turned back to his station. He had grown up in Lagos. She knew that because she had read every file on every member of this crew before she accepted them. Not their service records, those were just numbers, but their personal histories, the shape of their families, the things that had made them want to be here. HFY's grandmother had been born 6 years after Myron. She was 94 years old and still alive in the city his family had called home for 4 generations. He had told Crane this once, near the beginning of the deployment, standing at the viewport looking at nothing. He had not been looking for a response. He had been putting the fact in the air so it existed somewhere outside of him. Crane had not responded. She had just listened and then let it settle. She knew about Myron. Everyone knew about Myron. It was taught in schools, not as history exactly, more like geography. More like the name of the thing that shaped the land you lived on, the event that had made the terrain of the last 200 years what it was. 14,000 people. A Dominion surveyor that had catalogued the station as an uninhabited rocky body and removed the obstruction. Logged as a routine clearing action. Filed. Archived. Not malicious. And that, as Crane had understood since she was old enough to understand anything, was the part that was hardest to sit with. Not malicious. They just hadn't looked. She had been in the fleet for 31 years. She had been in this specific chair, the command chair of the Verdun, for 3. Before that, she had been one of the people who built the ship. Before that, she had been one of the people who designed the weapons systems. Before that, she had been a junior analyst in the program that had spent 40 years reverse engineering the drive fragments salvaged from the wreckage of the first Dominion surveyor that had ever entered human space. Not the one that had destroyed Myron, but the first one, the one that had shown humanity what was out there before humanity was ready to go there. The program had no official name. It was listed in budget documents under a category called long-term propulsion research. Nobody outside it had ever asked what it was actually researching. That was the thing about working quietly. People didn't ask questions about quiet things. The Verdun was what 60 years of quiet looked like. 80 years of planning before that. 140 years of accumulated grief, precision, and patience before a single plate of hull was welded into place. The communication channel was still open. The Dominion commander, Crane, had pulled his service file from their navigational database 3 weeks ago. Name Verath Sol, 30 years of service, reliable, methodical, good in a crisis. Hadn't responded yet. She had expected that. The silence after her opening statement was calculated. Let him sit in it. Let him think about what it meant that they had been watching for 10 of 11 minutes. Let that number do its work. "They're formulating a response," her communications officer reported. "Linguistic processing is active on their end. They're preparing a hail." "Good," Crane said. Verath Sol's response came through. It was careful. It was professional. It asked for vessel identification, origin confirmation, and a statement of human space, meaning. Where did humanity claim authority? What were the boundaries? What gave them the right to declare any stretch of the Varen corridor their space? Crane listened to the whole thing. "We know the protocol," she said. "We wrote a version of it ourselves, but let's skip ahead." She nodded to her communications officer, who sent the transmission they had prepared. It was a file, a large one. It took 4 minutes to complete the transfer. The Dominion ship systems were fast. The file was just large. It contained everything. Every registered human warship, active and in reserve. Every weapons system with technical specifications. Every deployment record for the last 50 years. Every military installation humanity had built in the solar system and outside it. Everything. Not because they were threatening the Dominion. Not as a show of force exactly. More like proof of work. 200 years of proof, compressed into a file and delivered across empty space to a man who thought humanity was still pre-warp. She imagined him opening it. She imagined the first page. She drank her bad coffee and waited. On the Verdun *S tactical screen, Akaffer was watching the Dominion ship's power readings, looking for weapons charge, looking for any sign of an aggressive shift. There was none. The ship was holding position, running its sensors over the Verdun in the way that ships do when they are trying very hard to understand something they cannot understand, and which makes them look, from the outside, almost desperate. "They've opened the file," communications reported. "How long have they been on it?" Crane asked. 40 seconds. "They'll close it soon," she said. She was right. 63 seconds after opening, the file was closed. Then there was silence from the Dominion ship for a long time, 7 minutes, which was, she had not predicted that specifically, but it was in range. The range of a man who has just been handed a shape of the world he didn't know existed and needs to find somewhere to put it. Then his communication system activated. Not to contact them, to contact someone else. She could see from the signal pattern that he was bouncing a transmission inward, toward the Dominion interior, toward, if the signal path held true, High Command. Akaffer turned to look at her. She raised an eyebrow slightly. He almost smiled, almost. The Dominion commander's outbound signal was encoded. Naturally, they weren't going to be able to hear it, but they could hear the fact of it. A patrol ship commander, in a routine corridor, burning a priority signal to High Command. That fact alone would tell the people on the other end everything they needed to know about what he had found. Then, after a short pause, the commander's open channel came back live. Not to Crane. Back to High Command. She caught the signal before it encoded, just barely, just the first few words. He was confirming his identity, his position, his authority level, and then he was saying he needed to be connected to the advisory council because the encryption kicked in. But she had heard enough. She set down her coffee. She looked at Akaffer. He was very still now, not the trembling stillness of before. Something different, the stillness of a person who has been holding something for a very long time and has just been told that the thing is real, and the holding was worth it, and the next part is beginning now. "It's starting," he said quietly. "It started 200 years ago," Crane said. "This is just the part where they notice. The Galactic Empire scanned it twice. Impossible. That can't be a human warship." Verath Sol listened to High Command's response with his face very still. It was not a long response. 12 minutes from his transmission to their answer fast, which told him his signal had been prioritized the moment it arrived, which told him that whoever had decoded enough of what he said to understand what he was reporting had escalated it immediately. 12 minutes for the Dominion's High Command to go from routine traffic processing to a direct response to a patrol fleet commander in a forgotten corridor was, in Verath Sol's experience, nearly instantaneous. He had sent priority signals to High Command twice in 30 years of service. The first time, during the Pelly's incident, they had taken 3 days to respond. The second time, for an equipment failure that had seemed more serious than it was, they had taken a week. 12 minutes meant they were scared. He listened to the response. He kept his face still. Around him, his bridge crew was trying to pretend they were working, which meant they were watching him out of the corners of their eyes and absorbing everything they could from the lines of his shoulders and the set of his jaw, because the content of a priority encrypted command channel was above their clearance, and the commander's face was the only information available to them. He kept it still until the channel closed. Then he sat down. Soren, at the sensor station, did not turn around. He was running more scans on the human ship. He had been running more scans since the channel opened and hadn't stopped. It was the thing to do when you didn't know what else to do. "They're sending a convoy," Verath Sol said. "Diplomatic?" Soren asked. "Full protocol," He paused. 12 ships. Full diplomatic protocol in the Dominion was reserved for first contact with species classified Tier 6 or above. The tier system ran from 1 to 10. Tier 6 meant a civilization with established FTL travel, significant military capability, and at least 2 systems under settled occupation. Humanity, in their file, was Tier 2. The convoy was for what they had seen in the corridor, not what the file said, what the scanner had returned. How long? Soren asked. 4 days. 4 days. Varath Sol looked at the main screen. The human ship was still there, still holding position. Not moving, not charging, not doing anything except existing in a way that made all his professional instincts itch like a healing wound. At high command, he knew people were opening that file. The file the human ship had transmitted. He imagined what that looked like: analysts pulling up the data, running it through their own systems, trying to match what was on the page to what they knew about what was possible. He imagined the silences in those rooms, the phone calls, the rising voices that would eventually be replaced with very deliberate quiet. He had seen one page of the file himself. He had opened it and looked at the first entry, a ship class designation, a mass figure, a weapons configuration, and then he had closed it. Not because it wasn't relevant, because he needed a moment before he could read it the way an officer should read intelligence data, which was to say, calmly and without his hands doing anything strange. The mass figure on the first entry was smaller than what the Verdun scanned at, which meant the Verdun was not their largest ship, which meant there were larger ones, somewhere. He thought about all the corridors in Dominion space that his patrol had logged as empty over the years. He thought about the phrase, "We've been watching you for 10. He decided to stop thinking about it and think about what he could do, which was to stay in position, monitor the human ship, log everything, and wait for the convoy. In the Weapons Research Division of Dominion High Command, a senior analyst named Vera Kissa had been assigned to assess the human military file at 300 Standard Time. She was not happy about the hour. She was also, within 15 minutes, no longer thinking about the hour. The file was organized differently than Dominion military registries. Human organizational logic ran on different principles, more layered, less hierarchical, with cross-references built into the structure that assumed the reader would jump around rather than read linearly. She had adapted to this by the second hour and was moving through it quickly by the third. The weapons systems were her section. She flagged 3 entries within the first pass. Flagged them not because they were familiar, but because they were at the edge of familiar concepts she recognized as theoretical, things Dominion weapons researchers had explored, and then set aside as inefficient or impractical, appearing here as developed, tested, and deployed. It was like reading a history of a branch of physics that her civilization had walked down to a certain point and then turned back from, and finding that someone else had kept walking. Then she reached the entry for the asterisk, uns Verdun asterisk. She stopped. She read the figure for the main rail acceleration system. The number was not formatted in Dominion units. She had to convert it. She ran the conversion twice because the first result did not make sense to her in the way that numbers sometimes don't make sense when they are too far outside normal operating range to feel real. The second result was the same as the first. She called her supervisor. He was there in 4 minutes. He stood next to her and looked at the screen. She read the figure aloud in converted Dominion units. He asked her to read it again. She did. He sat down on the floor. Not in a chair, on the floor. He just lowered himself down until he was sitting on the floor next to her station chair with his back against the console, and he stayed there for a moment saying nothing. "That's for 1 ship," she said. "I know," he said. "There are 47 in this class listed," she said. He closed his eyes. She pulled up the next section, drive systems. The human ships used what their file called a layered redundant drive architecture. She could see the basic principle from the description, but the implementation details went beyond what she could parse without a full engineering team. The short version was this: there was no single point of failure in the drive system. Not one. Each component had 3 backups. Each backup had 2 of its own. A Dominion warship could be disabled by targeting specific structural nodes. This ship class, based on the file, appeared to have engineered out every single one of those nodes. She flagged the section for the engineering team. Then the armor. The hull material was listed under a designation she couldn't find in any Dominion materials database. Not a variant, not a derivative, an original material. She searched the Dominion Scientific Registry for any reference to the alloy composition described. Nothing. She searched the broader alien technology database. Nothing. The humans had developed, in apparent secrecy, a hull material that did not exist anywhere in 200 years of Dominion scientific cataloging. She sat with that for a while. Her supervisor was still on the floor. He had pulled his knees up and was looking at the middle distance the way people look when they are trying to understand something that keeps being bigger than the space they can hold it in. "How long do you think this took?" he asked. She had been running that calculation. The ship itself, construction minimum 40 years based on the material volumes. The materials, sourcing, development, another 20 before that. The drive system research before that. She paused. The beginning of this project, if I had to date it, would be, she checked the historical record, roughly 200 years ago. He was quiet. The incident at Myron Station was approximately 200 years ago, she said. He said nothing. I don't think that's a coincidence, she said. On the Verdun asterisk, HFY stood alone in the corridor outside the command deck for the first time in 3 weeks and breathed. Just breathed. The recycled air, the faint hum of the ship around him, the sound of it, which was different from any other ship he had served on, heavier and lower, like the sound of something that knew what it was built for. He had read, during his deployment application process, the construction history of the Verdun. He had read it in one sitting and then gone for a very long walk. The people who had designed this ship had known they would probably never see it fly. The project had started when his grandmother was a child. The people who poured the first specs had poured them knowing the ship would take 4 decades to build, that they would retire or die before it launched, that the moment it was built for was at minimum a generation away from them. They had done it anyway. They had done it in detail, in silence, with patience that HFY could not fully hold in his mind without it, making him feel very small and very large at the same time. He thought about his grandmother, 94 years old, born 6 years after Myron, a woman who had spent her whole life knowing what everyone in humanity knew, what had been done, and why it hadn't been an act of war but almost something worse, an act of carelessness, of being not important enough to look at before destroying. He had wanted to tell her he was on this ship. He hadn't been allowed to. The mission was classified until it happened. Now it was happening. He went back to the bridge. Crane was at her station, looking at the Dominion patrol ship's readings. "They've gone quiet," she said. "No more outbound signals, they're waiting." "For the convoy," HFY said. 4 days, she confirmed. She glanced at him. "Go sleep." "I'm fine." "You've been awake for 30 hours. You'll be fine after you sleep." He started to argue. She looked at him once. He went to sleep. Soren did not sleep. He ran his analysis through the night cycle, not tactical analysis, something else. He had started trying to calculate from the observable data the hull density, the drive emissions profile, the materials showing in spectral analysis, how long the Verdun had been in space, how long it had been built. He was not a construction engineer, but he was a very good analyst, and the math that came back was consistent enough that he trusted it. The ship was old. Not old like a vessel that had been in service a long time. Old like something that had been made slowly, over a long time, by people who were in no hurry. The build signatures were different from Dominion construction, more deliberate, more layered, like a thing that had been worked on in stages over years with care between each stage rather than manufactured to a schedule. 40 years minimum, maybe 50. He thought about what that meant. He thought about a species in a Tier 2 file, sitting in one system, with no FTL capability logged and no military worth nodding, who had spent 50 years building one ship in secret while the Dominion never looked twice. He opened the historical file on humanity, the 2 pages, read them again. The survey encounter 200 years ago, listed as uneventful, logged by the survey ship as brief contact with primitive biological species, no significant exchange, no obstacles to survey completion. Myron body cleared. Myron body cleared. He looked out through the viewport at the dark ship holding position in the corridor. He opened his personal mission log and started a new entry. He wrote, "I don't think we're dealing with a military. I think we're dealing with a people who decided to become one." He saved it. He did not share it with Verath Sol. Then he went back to his analysis and kept working. Outside, through the viewport, the Verdun held its position in the dark, patient as a fact that has been waiting to be looked at. The Galactic Empire scanned it twice, impossible, that can't be a human warship. The convoy arrived on the morning of the 4th day, Dominion Standard Time, which Crane's crew had been tracking alongside their own ship's clock out of professional habit. 12 ships, formation perfect. They came out of their transit point with the precise spacing and alignment that spoke of a military that took its ceremony seriously, that understood the weight of arrival, that wanted the first thing an observer saw to be order. They arranged themselves in a wide semicircle facing the Verdun asterisk, which was the standard diplomatic positioning, non-aggressive but forward-claiming presence without claiming attack. It was well done, Crane noted it. Then she nodded to HFY. He activated the signal that had been waiting for 4 days. 14 ships uncloaked. They had been there the whole time, positioned around the corridor's perimeter in a dispersal pattern that put 2 human vessels within effective range of each Dominion ship in the convoy, without any of them being positioned aggressively relative to the convoy as a group. It was not a threatening formation. Threatening would have meant weapons forward, tight clustering, postures of intent. This was something else. This was simply the revelation that the room humanity had invited the Dominion into had already been full when they arrived. The convoy's formation did not break. Crane gave them credit for that. The ships held position, but her long-range sensors showed the pattern of internal signals spiking across all 12 vessels, crew alerts, system checks, the rapid chatter of command staff processing the fact that they had just arrived at what they thought was an empty diplomatic meeting site and found themselves contained. The convoy commander opened a channel. "Admiral," the voice was even, controlled. "Can you explain the purpose of this configuration?" Crane said, "Just making sure the formation is even." A pause. "I see. You're welcome to adjust," she said. "We'll match whatever you do." Another pause. Then, "We would like to propose a neutral meeting site, somewhere off the ships themselves. Our records show a derelict trade station at coordinates." "Waypoint 7, Crane said. "We know it, we've been there." A beat of silence that had a shape to it. The shape of a question the convoy commander had not expected to be preempted on. "You've been to the station?" he asked. "We renovated it," she said. 40 years ago, we've kept it operational since. There's a full conference facility on level 3. The coffee is better than what we have on the ship, which isn't saying much, but it's something." She closed the channel. HFY was doing the thing where he was extremely focused on his console, so she couldn't see his face, which meant he was somewhere between laughing and something else. "Set a course," she said. Point 7 was 17 minutes from their position. Crane arrived first and waited in the level 3 conference room with a cup of the station's coffee, which was, in fact, marginally better, and the station's chief administrator, who was a quiet, efficient woman named Dr. Yemi Park, who had been maintaining the station with a crew of 40 for the last 6 years, and who greeted the arrival of the Dominion convoy with the same expression she used for supply delays. Mild displeasure, quickly managed. The Dominion's delegation was led by a diplomat named Vor. He was tall, by Dominion standards, and wore the formal diplomatic uniform with the kind of comfort that meant he had worn it many times in high-stakes rooms and had learned to use it as part of his presence. He was good. Crane could see that immediately. He walked into the conference room and took in the human setup, the chairs arranged to avoid any hierarchical positioning, the room that was clean and functional, and showed no signs of having been assembled quickly, the station that was maintained and running and real. And she watched him absorb that information without letting it show in anything except the brief, precise scan of his eyes. He sat down. His 2 advisors sat on either side. He looked at Crane. "Admiral Crane," he said. "Ambassador Vor," she said. She had pulled his service record from their files. 20 years of diplomatic service. 73 successful treaty negotiations. He had never lost one. "I've been asked to convey," he began, "that the Dominion acknowledges the significance of this encounter and approaches it with the intention of—" "I know what you were asked to convey," Crane said. "The intention of establishing open dialogue, mutual recognition, and a framework for ongoing relation. Standard opening. We have a version of it, too." He paused. Then something shifted slightly in his expression, not annoyance. More like the adjustment a skilled person makes when they realize the room they're in requires different tools than the ones they brought. "Then perhaps," he said, "you'd like to tell me what you're looking for." "One thing," Crane said. He waited. "A record correction," she said. "In the Dominion's official historical archive, the entry for Myron Station. We want the record to correctly state that it was a populated human settlement, that it contained 14,000 people, that those people were killed when the station was destroyed during a Dominion survey action, that this is an acknowledged fact." She paused. No softening, no tragic accident language, no incomplete data at time of action. What happened, stated as what it was. Vor looked at her for a moment. "That's all," he said. "That's everything," she said. He was quiet. Crane could see him working through it, the experienced diplomat's calculation of what the actual ask was, and what it would cost, and what it meant that this was the ask. That after 200 years and whatever the Dominion's analysts had found in that file, and the 14 ships that had appeared out of nowhere in the corridor, the opening position was a sentence in an archive. "We can discuss," he began, "in addition to any record matter, the possibility of economic partnership, resource exchange, elevated classification." "We don't want a trade deal," Crane said. "Federation membership is something the Council has the authority to." "We didn't build all of this to get a better trade deal," Crane said. The room was quiet. Vor sat back slightly, not far, just enough. "Then what did you build it for?" he asked, genuinely, not as a negotiating move. Crane looked at him. "To make sure you looked," she said. HFY walked the station during a break in the 3rd session. He didn't have a reason to. His tactical work was done for the day. Crane had released the bridge crew in rotation and told them to eat, rest, exist for a few hours in something wider than a chair. He walked because the station was wide enough to walk in, and he needed to be somewhere that wasn't inside his own head. The station had 3 residential levels, a cargo bay that was now being used as a general assembly space, a functional medical unit, a small hydroponic garden that Dr. Park had expanded beyond original specs because she said it was good for morale, and she was right. It smelled like growing things. He stood in the garden for a few minutes and let it smell like growing things. Then he kept walking. Level 2. Storage, engineering access, the long corridor that ran the length of the station's main axis. He found it there. He almost walked past it. The wall looked like the others at first, the same structural material, the same faint variations in surface that came from decades of use and maintenance. But it was different. He stopped because something made him stop, and he looked, and then he understood what he was looking at. Names. Every square centimeter of the wall for a 40-meter stretch was covered in names, not printed or projected or stamped, carved, physically, manually, with something small and precise, into the material of the wall itself. Each name given its own space, each letter clean and deliberate. 14,000 names. He looked at the wall for a long time. He put his hand against the surface. The material was cool. The carved lines were slightly rough under his fingertips. He traced one name. He didn't know whose it was. He had no way of knowing, and felt the shape of the letters. Someone had done this. Someone had come to this station, in this empty corridor, and spent. He couldn't calculate it without thinking too hard, and he didn't want to think too hard right now. Weeks or months or longer carving 14,000 names into a wall where nobody would see them, except the people who already knew them. He stood there for a while. Then he kept walking, because that was what you did. That was what they had always done. You knew what the names meant, and you kept walking. Soren, back on the *Korth*, ran one more analysis. He had been running analyses for 4 days. Not because he was ordered to, because he couldn't stop. There was something in the data about the Verdun that kept pulling at him, not the weapons figures or the drive specs or the hull material, all of which were extraordinary, but something underneath those things. Something about the shape of the work. He was trying to calculate the minimum timeline. How long it would have taken from scratch, with no Dominion technology base to work from, for humanity to go from what they had been at the time of the Myern incident, pre-warp, one system, basic space access, to what was sitting in the corridor now. The answer kept coming back the same. The project had to have started within a generation of Myern, maybe within a decade. The materials sourcing alone required infrastructure that took decades to build, and that infrastructure had to have been built before the materials were sourced, and before that there had to have been a decision. A clear, collective, generational decision that this was what humanity was going to do. Not vengeance, not immediately, not a war plan. A project. He thought about what that meant. A species that had been wronged, and the file on Myern made clear that they knew it, that this was not ambiguous to them, and had responded not by attacking, not by making demands, not even by making themselves known, by working, for 200 years, quietly, building something so undeniable that when they finally chose to be seen, the Dominion would have no response except to look. They hadn't needed to fire a single weapon. They were never going to fire a single weapon. The weapons existed so that the possibility existed, so that the conversation could happen from a position that couldn't be dismissed. The fleet was not an army. It was an argument. He opened his log. Read the entry he had written on the second night. I don't think we're dealing with a military. I think we're dealing with a people who decided to become one. He sat with that. Then he added a line below it. The difference matters more than I initially understood. In the conference room, a Selvor made one last attempt at the end of the third session. He had not given up on the broader framework. He was too experienced for that. He had been patient, had listened, had slowly and carefully understood that the human position was not a negotiating starting point. It was a destination. What he was working with now was how to reach it in a way that served both sides. But he tried one more approach. The survey action, he said carefully, while the loss of life is devastating, was conducted with incomplete data at the time. There was no malicious intent. The surveyor had no way of knowing. Crane looked at him. Just looked. He stopped. The look wasn't angry. He would have been more comfortable with anger. It was patient. The way a mountain is patient when you ask it a question it has heard before. We know, she said. He waited because he could feel there was more. "That's worse," she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. He had 73 successful treaty negotiations behind him. He had been in rooms with species that wanted war, species that wanted wealth, species that wanted territory. He knew how to answer all of those. He knew how to find the underlying want beneath the stated position and address it in a way that left everyone with something. He did not have an answer for this. 14,000 people, cleared because nobody had looked. No malicious intent. The words he had been about to use, the careful diplomatic phrasing that acknowledged harm while distributing responsibility, that made space for remediation and forward motion, sat in his throat and went nowhere. "We know," she had said. And it was worse. He closed his notes. "I'll need to consult with the council," he said. "Take your time," Crane said. "We've been waiting 200 years. We can wait a few more days." The Galactic Empire scanned it twice. "Impossible. That can't be a human warship." The council's answer came back in 2 days. Crane had expected 3, but they surprised her. She took that as a sign of something, not fear, exactly. More like understanding. The kind of understanding that arrives when you have sat with a problem long enough that the shape of it finally becomes clear, and you realize there is only one path through it, and the sooner you take it the better. Aselvor met her in the conference room on level 3 at 900. He had his 2 advisors again. He had a recording device. He had, she noticed, the careful expression of a man who had made peace with something in the last 2 days and had arrived here ready to do what needed to be done. She had Akafor and her chief of staff, Commander Rena Vasquez. Vasquez was 51, originally from Montevideo, and had the particular stillness of a person who understood what rooms like this one cost and was determined not to waste the moment. They sat. Aselvor opened a document on the table's display surface and turned it to face Crane. She read it. It was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph stated, in formal Dominion archival language, that Myron Station was a populated human settlement, that it had a recorded population of 14,000 individuals at the time of its destruction, that it was destroyed during a Dominion survey action on the date on record, that this destruction resulted in total loss of life. The second paragraph stated that this event was formally acknowledged by the Orathi Dominion as a fact of recorded history, and that the prior archival classification of the station as uninhabited was rescinded and replaced by the correct record. No softening, no incomplete data at time of action, no tragic accident. What happened, stated as what it was. Crane read it once. She read it again. She picked up her coffee, the station's coffee, which was in fact better than the ship's, and drank some of it. Set it down. Looked at the document for one more moment. Then she said, "This is acceptable." Aselvor exhaled. She caught it, a small, controlled release of tension that a less experienced person wouldn't have managed to keep that small. He had been carrying something into this room, and now he put it down. "The Council," he said, "would like to discuss in a subsequent session the question of formal relations. Classification review, diplomatic representation, the broader." "We know," Crane said. "We'll discuss it, but not today." He nodded. That was the right answer, and he knew it. The signing was simple. Both parties authenticated the document through their respective systems. It entered the Dominion's live archive at 9:47 station time. Somewhere in the Dominion servers, a record that had sat unchanged for 200 years was updated. Myron Station, populated human settlement. Population 14,000, status destroyed. Cause, Dominion survey action. Akafor was watching his screen when the confirmation came through. He did not say anything. He sat very still for a moment, and then something in his face moved, not dramatically, not loudly, the way things move in people who have been holding them for a long time and have finally been allowed to set them down. He pressed his fist to his mouth once, briefly. Then he went back to work. Vasquez put a hand on his shoulder for 3 seconds and then took it away. She didn't say anything either. There was nothing that needed saying. The Dominion's classification review took 7 days. Soren was part of it, pulled from his position on the Asterisk Korath, and assigned to a working group tasked with producing a revised entry for humanity in the Galactic Species Register. The group had 5 members. They had access to all of the data from the human military file, from their own analytical assessments, from a brief cultural exchange document that the human diplomatic team had provided, a dry, factual overview of humanity's history, development, and current status, written in a style that was remarkably free of self-promotion, which Soren found somehow more unsettling than if it had been full of it. The working group spent 4 days on the technical sections. FTL capability, confirmed and detailed, military capacity, substantial, and the number of vessels listed made 3 of the 5 members go quiet for long stretches. Technology tier. The group spent an entire day on this one, arguing about metrics and benchmarks and what the current tier system was actually designed to measure and whether it was adequate to describe what they were looking at. On the 5th day, they reached the summary classification field. This was the field that determined, in one phrase, how humanity would be categorized in the Dominion's foundational reference system. The field that every new Dominion officer, every diplomat, every analyst would read first when they pulled up the human file. The previous entry, pre-warp non-aggressive Tier 2. The group proposed alternatives for 3 hours. Advanced tier independent military power. That was accurate but felt incomplete. Tier 8 FTL capable significant armament. That was more technically precise but missed something. Species of note military and technological peer. Closer, but peer implied equivalence in a specific way that wasn't quite right either. Soren said nothing for most of this discussion. He sat with his notes and his analysis and the private log entry he had written on the second night in the corridor, which he had read again that morning. Eventually the group ran out of proposals and looked at him, because he was the one who had been there first, who had run the scan, who had watched this unfold from the beginning. He looked at the blank field. He typed, species with long memory. The group was quiet. Someone said, "That's not a technical classification." No, Soren agreed. The format requires. I know what the format requires, he said. I'm putting this in the field. His supervisor, who had been on the floor that night in the weapons research office, was not in this room, but Soren thought about him anyway, about the floor, about reading a number twice and then sitting down. Species with long memory, he said, leave it. They left it. On the Asterisk Korath Asterisk, Verath Sul stood at the observation deck for the first time in the week he had been in the corridor. He stood there for a long time. The Verdun was still visible. It had remained in position throughout the negotiations, throughout the diplomatic sessions, throughout the signing and the classification review and all of it. Patient, immovable. The way things are when they have been waiting long enough that waiting is no longer something they do, but simply something they are. In 3 days the convoy would depart. The human fleet, the 14 ships that had uncloaked plus the Verdun Asterisk itself, would presumably depart as well, though he understood now that presumably was a word he should use carefully in relation to anything humanity chose to do. They had been in this corridor for 3 weeks before the patrol arrived. They had been in this corridor 40 years ago when they renovated the station. They moved or didn't move according to their own calculations, and their calculations ran on a timeline that was not his. He thought about the ship. He had been thinking about the ship since the beginning, trying to understand what it was. Not technically, he had the technical data now, the weapon specs and the drive type and the hull composition, all of it catalogued and filed and sent to high command. He understood what the Verdun was in those terms. What he was still working on was the other thing, the meaning of it. A warship, built over 40 years, never fired in anger, brought here not to threaten or to attack but to be undeniable, to force a conversation that could not be forced any other way, to make the Dominion look at something it had decided was too small to look at in a way that could not be ignored, at a scale that could not be dismissed. The weapons existed so that the weapons wouldn't have to be used. The ship existed so that a record correction could be made. He thought about that a great deal, the calculus of it, the patience of it. A species that had absorbed a wrong so large it should have become a war and had turned it into a project, had built something extraordinary with it, had waited until the moment was right and then simply arrived and said, "Look at us. Look at what we became because of what you did. Now correct the record." That was all. He had been in the fleet for 30 years. He had thought he understood what a military was for. He looked at the dark ship in the viewport. He was less sure now. He thought about the scan, running back to the beginning of all of this, Soren, at his station, saying the scan returned an error, and he had assumed the machine was wrong. The machine had never been wrong before, but there was a first time for everything, and it was easier to assume a malfunction than to sit with what the numbers were actually saying. The machine had been right. The machine had scanned something that should not have existed and returned correct data, and he had almost walked away from it because the correct data was impossible. Because a Tier 2 species did not have ships like this. Because he knew what humanity was and it was not this. He hadn't known what humanity was. He wondered how many other things in the Dominion's files were 2 pages long and last updated 150 years ago. In corridors the patrol ships had logged as empty. He wondered what else was out there, patient and working, waiting to be found. He put his hand on the viewport glass. The Verdun was a dark shape against the stars, massive, still, holding its position without effort the way things hold position that were built to stay. He stood there until the watch changed, and then he went back to his desk and started writing a new report. Not the routine one, not the form about nothing, a different kind. The kind that was harder to write. The kind that required him to say, "I was wrong about what was here. I was wrong about what was possible. I was wrong about what I was looking at." He started with the scan. He wrote at 1400 standard, fleet analyst Soren ran a routine corridor sweep. The system returned an error. He ran it again. He stopped there for a moment. The system was right. On the station, in the quiet hour after the signing, Akafer went to the Level 3 communications suite and opened a personal channel. He had requested permission from Crane 3 days ago. She had said, after. He was after now. He pulled up his grandmother's address. 94 years old. Lagos. He had the document, the official Dominion archive correction, time-stamped and authenticated and permanent, a record that would now exist in the Galactic registry for as long as the Dominion existed. He thought about what to write. He had been thinking about it for 3 weeks. He had composed versions in his head during the long waiting days on the Verdun asterisk, during the sessions in the conference room, during the walk through the corridor with the names on the wall. He sent the document, no text, just the document, let it say what it said. He waited. Her reply came back in 4 hours. 94 years old, a generation removed from the thing that had started all of this. A woman who had lived her whole life with the shape of it in the background of everything, who had raised children who became people like him, who ended up in places like this. 2 words. About time. He read it twice. He folded his hands on the console and sat with it. Then he closed the channel and went to find Crane, because she was probably drinking bad coffee somewhere on this station, and he thought he might join her, and they could sit for a while without talking, which was one of the things she was very good at and which he was, slowly, learning. Outside, through the viewport of the observation deck that nobody was standing at anymore, the Verdun held its position in the dark corridor, patient, enormous, Done. It had never fired a weapon. It never needed to.